So as we're setting these boundaries, as we're asserting those, and the expectation that people are going to be supportive of our wishes and our pathway to be who we want to be our true self. Because keep in mind, when we feel as though we have to put on a mask, when we feel as though we have to be someone who we're not, imagine that type of individual, how you're going to feel. You're going to feel soulless.
Hey everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome back to our show, Ascending Thoughts, our podcast where we discuss the issues of the day with our business advisor, Mr. Rogers. And over his many years of business advice and just personal advice, I just wanted to welcome Mr. Rogers back to the show. Will, it's a pleasure to have you again with us.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. Welcome, neighbors out there in our metahood, our neighborhood in the metaverse. This is a safe space where we can all come together in our social media environment to come and discuss the issues of the day and how we can basically uplift one another to a better, more prosperous and brighter future ahead.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm so glad to have you here with us again so that you can teach us some of the founding principles to help enlighten us to grow to better life, business, and personal success. Let's get right back into it here. Coming back from our previous show where we were talking about bridging the divide, I wanted to step into bringing up more unity and going on to that. William, can you just give us a quick little recap here of the previous show and how we're going to move back into today?
One of the aspects is, as we are trying to go through in terms of these previous episodes, which were more of covering in terms of in the building in the toolbox of mental health, is what a lot of people need to recognize. And people ask the question, as I have spent my years as an accountant and financial advisor, well, what does mental health, what does our attitude, how we feel about ourselves have to do with our finances? Well, our finances, our budget, and what we do is just the external factor, but these building blocks that go into it are directly correlated. And so that's why we've spent so much time in terms of in trying to build those basic principles so that people can have the overall wherewithal and build the resilience necessary and mental awareness so that they can basically have the fortitude to basically propel forward. And one key aspect is we're trying to come together in our own personal development, our professional, and society as a whole. We have to find ways to find unity. We cannot do things on an island. We cannot be successful by ourselves. And we presented a 6-point toolkit of basically what are the 6 basic core principles of trying to bring people together. Now, one aspect that we have to be completely aware and sober about is that you're never going to get complete agreement. You're never going to get 100% consensus. But one of the last prongs is we also have to identify when people have their own agenda, when they want to sabotage because of their own motive, that they don't have an interest in coming together. They profit off of people being divided and at each other's throat. And unfortunately, that's a sad reality. And as I have mentioned to you on numerous occasions about narcissism, there are those who for profiting in whatever reasons. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about how do we break up and draw the line.
Yeah, and that, once again, that point comes from that last tangible prong from those 6 principles is to identify the profiteers and saboteurs, and at a certain point in time you're going to have to make the decision to break up.
So interesting as we were talking about, in terms of in the last show, in our 6-point in terms of, framework of basically bridging the divide, one of the key tools in the last of the 6 is basically trying to identify those who have no interest in coming together, what I like to call the saboteur or those that are the incorrigibles. And so in terms of in today's show, what we want to now delve into is where we start to draw that line and how to go about a breakup.
Yeah, exactly. And right here for topic one, I want to talk about the people and the relationships that we have in society, and what are some of the metrics that you go off of personally and as a business advisor to console with people about whether they need to make the decision to make that breakup.
Well, we start taking in terms of an account in our own personal lives, and as you have seen, Brian, as our approach on this show is we talk about the nexus of the triad, and the triad is the three sides of an equilateral triangle of our personal life, our professional life, and then when we put those together, the base of what we're trying to do in our society as a whole. And we have to make sure that each side is equally whole so that we can be, in terms of a whole, healthy person to basically propel ourselves to ascend forward. And one of the aspects when we start to go and look at, we need to start taking in terms of inventory and account in the health of our own personal relationships, whether it's in our own romantic relationships, our friends, our family. And unfortunately, is what I have seen, and many people will confide into me privately, we make an assumption that friends or family members, because we're related by blood, have our best interests at heart, that they love us. But unfortunately, many of these dynamics in family can be complex, and they could be precisely the individuals who are sabotaging our lives, who are enabling us to what we call negative type of behaviors, and they're the ones that we have to get divorced from.
And for example, people, I want to talk about that. I know that taking personal inventory is such a big thing that a lot of people, as they progress in age and increase their emotional intelligence, taking a personal and moral inventory is key, because then you can look outward along with looking inward in yourself, and really to digest and understand, are the people around you making you happy, or are they, once again, as you said, profiting or being a saboteur for themselves? And what are some of the expectations and the boundaries that you can set for a personal relationship so that you can live to your best and fullest life?
So when we're looking in terms of in respect to our own personal romantic relationships, and I know that how some of you out there in the audience is going to feel about how you're going about your personal romantic relationship, or that let's say there are certain friendships in your life or family members that you're just feeling in terms of it's become really toxic, it's become contentious, and it's just really detracting and draining. We have to start taking serious consideration of how to go about that process of breaking up what I call disassociating ourselves. It's a necessary process. Because part of when we're trying to go in and take control of our lives, and as you're setting those boundaries, boundaries are designed to how we can, as a person, understand and assert what we need to do to take control of our lives, to feel empowered, and demonstrate respect. Too many people feel as though that they are being emotionally abused, that they are becoming a lapdog, stepped on, walked on all over, that they're not being supported, empathized. And so these are the hallmarkers of basically relationships that we essentially have to divorce ourselves from. So trying to start setting those boundaries is important. When we're going in terms of in that process, part of in terms of in setting boundaries is we need to have the courage to start asserting some of those of what we call in terms of in those expectations. So let me give you, for example, as you may be talking about in your own romantic life, you may have to start setting in terms of and expressing in a proper and polite way to your partner is these are in terms of in some of the boundaries that I'm expecting. Like say, for example, If I am trying to spend some time with friends, or if there is it's an important boundary for me that I need a Sunday afternoon to myself, I want that feeling that it's okay and that my independence is necessary versus that you are feeling a sense of jealousy or disrespect and trying to give me in terms of some guilt trip because I wanted to have that. I'm just giving a little simple example of how people are going at that process of litigating and asserting in terms of themselves of your personal need. Now, as we're gauging in that discussion, you have to, as a person, also show to that other person, what are your needs? Because too often in any of these relationships, they're all one-sided. That person also has to start basically conveying some of what their needs are. It can't just be a blame dump fest.
Yeah, and that's why communication is so important.
It is, but here's what I'm doing is we're probing out the minefield area is where we're trying to have a mature in terms of discussion is where you're talking about in terms of your need and what is their need versus getting into a finger pointing. Because if we keep going in terms of and down that path, it basically is we have to make that determination of being hopeless and then basically divorce ourselves in terms of from some of that. There are also other dynamics that we have to flush out, and we have to also kind of identify, do we truly feel that they have our best interests at heart? And sometimes that can be a little bit cloaked. And what may be a little bit more evident in a professional dynamic or when we get in other settings, because when we're in these close, intimate ones, we can get a little blinded and we're not necessarily certain if those individuals may have our best interests at heart. Because it's okay that sometimes we may misunderstand each other. If we have each other's best interests at heart, we can solve a lot via communication. But if individuals don't have their best interests at heart, what do we basically have?
Right.
It's a usurious type of situation.
Yeah, and you want, and for the personal relationships, you want that team aspect. You want to come together and be unified and be able to uplift one another. And you said with personal space for that one example there, but communication to me is so crucial.
There is, but now let's take it a step forward. So as we're also looking at that and we're trying to better in terms of and articulate those needs, let's talk about in a family and in a very, what we call long-term romantic relationship, much of it could be what we call personal success, personal growth. And there's so many in terms of different dynamics, what I've seen in terms of family members, that there's a lot of envy and jealousy, that there's one individual child who's very bright, wants to become a doctor, and everyone else is feeling low. They're feeling envious of that person because they lack the education, they lack the intelligence, and they find passive-aggressive ways to sabotage this person. And unfortunately, it's a reality. And this can happen in terms of in some of the unfortunate dynamics in a lot of romantic relationships. There are females out there who are highly educated. They're becoming successful. And it can create a tremendous tension that maybe in some of their romantic partners that may not be doing as well financially. They may not be in terms of what we call a knowledge base or what we call white collar profession. It may be what we call a little bit more traditional blue collar, and it can create a tension in terms of it out there. And in what I see in terms of being conveyed to me is, there's the romance and working a personal relationship side, but how do we reconcile in terms of that? There's this term, when some people are saying dumbing down, there is no need to dumb down. If an individual is trying to be the best that they can be, no matter what your level of education in terms of background, how humble you are, our job is to cherish and support that person to be the best that they can be. How many of us, we were around a talented athlete, they may have gotten a scholarship to a big time university or gotten drafted professionally. Obviously, there was a group of people who were haters and who wanted them to get injured, wanted them to go broke. But there are others who really reveled in us and wanted them to succeed.
Yeah.
We need to be in that camp of wanting them to succeed. And this is what we also have to now start identifying. Are some of the people in our corner truly wanting us to succeed? Or are they really acting in terms that way because they are envious of the fact that you are trying to succeed? Because there's not always a perfect alignment in any family and any relationship about some people who have different goals and objectives. There are some people, who in families that they just want to have kids. They want to basically be the best mother and father. And then there are those in terms of family who are very career and business oriented. And you see a lot of guilt tripping going on that. Again, my takeaway is we are not here to be judgmental. We're here to be supportive.
Yeah, exactly.
And if someone chooses to be basically what we call a stay-at-home parent, we want to support and cherish what they're trying to do is to be the better self.
Because that's what makes them happy.
But also on the flip side, who are you to judge that individual who says, I do not want to have kids. I may wait to go and get married because I am going to pursue in terms of whatever career ambitions. And they both have the same last name. They're both from the same family. This is the classic dynamic that I see time and time again. And it's even more pronounced when you get out in different cultures, when you're seeing in terms of Hispanic, Asian, Middle East, these traditional cultural values weighing down and creating a pressure and a psyche on these individuals as though that they're doing something non-traditional, and in many respects it's unorthodox and immoral. And we have to be supportive and understanding to let people be their true selves. And unfortunately, too many of these dynamics are playing in our personal and family relationships. So as we're setting these boundaries, as we're asserting those, and the expectation that people are going to be supportive of our wishes and our pathway to be who we want to be our true self. Because keep in mind, when we feel as though we have to put on a mask, when we feel as though we have to be someone who we're not, imagine that type of individual, how you're going to feel. You're going to feel soulless, feel empty. You're going to be moving around there aimlessly. Why? Because you're trying to please your mother that she'll have grandkids. Because you are trying to please your significant other that I'm not going to keep making more money than him. But think of those kind of dynamics they're playing out there in today. You shouldn't have to apologize. You shouldn't have to excuse. You do deserve that people need to support you to be the best person that you can be, and they should love you regardless. That's the point.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, and in times, if you want to ascend, you also may have to draw the line in saying is, if you're not going to support me in terms of my wishes, is I'm going to have to keep my distance, because that's a boundary. Maybe in terms of how we keep our distance in a get-together for a Thanksgiving, a Christmas,
location.
whatever it is. But this is part of the journey that I've had to do in terms of in my own life, is set my own boundaries, is that from those who are either going to support me and I allow them in the circle, and those who are going to either bully me, who are going to kind of psychologically denigrate me and make me feel less than and less worthy, I've set a boundary to keep them away.
Yeah, and those boundaries are so important and I know you as being a little bit older than myself, and I'm still coming into my adult life, and every day I'm learning more and more and more about those expectations and setting them, and then those boundaries, and I'm still taking my moral inventory every day. And I think that the progress that everybody needs to make in those small steps, progress over perfection, and just to get yourself to ascend using all those tools.
Now, one of the other adjuncts that we want to talk about in terms of in breakups, and especially when we're talking about in the personal dynamic, there are certain what we call huge in terms of what I call difficulties, or when we put in terms of in these structural barriers. And codependency is one of the hugest. And we have to, as individuals who are not in it, in the marriage, in the relationship, in the family, but as outsiders and part of that supportive group, help provide aid and comfort and support to those, because it's very difficult when you think about, and as I see so many times in my professional practice, you have in terms of, a woman, it's a one paycheck household. She's a stay-at-home mother, takes care in terms of the kids, but for whatever reasons, subject to physical abuse, emotional abuse, but because of the ability to support themselves and take care of that family, allows to tolerate it in what we call an untenable, unhealthy, and destructive situation. And what I want to point out in terms of in the viewers, it is much more pervasive than we do believe. And a lot of times we end up questioning, well, if he's so bad, just leave. And many of these people who are in these situations go through that, but they're stuck in these hard situations is, I don't know what to do. He pays the bills. He's providing in terms of that. Where are we going to live? I haven't worked and all these things. Yeah. This is where we need this support group so that we can create this safe space so that they can have a way to safely leave. In addition, they have genuine fear for their safety, in addition to their financial well-being. And so when we're talking about the aspects of breakup and when we pivot into the professional, this financial pressure ends up becoming this huge gravity force field out there that for a lot of people say, I agree with you on all these things, but
the finances.
I'm 2 paychecks away from being on the street. And this is where we have to build this support,
that community.
Infrastructure, that community, because if we're alone on an island, we will feel hopeless.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's such a big point that you make. Your friend group, your close work friends, everything like that.
As well as those who we can speak in terms of confidentially, whether, in terms of you're giving confession to a priest, you have a therapist, you have in terms of those, you have to broaden that out. We do need in terms of a support group, not just for our own personal, emotional well-being, but also our professional as well, so that if we are going to plan to leave, we have a fallback and what I call a safety net of people who can support us to basically uplift us.
And on the other end of the spectrum, if someone does come to you asking for help, realize and understand that first step forward to come ask for help is huge. Yeah. It's huge. It's the biggest step there is, the first step to reach out to someone for that help.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, Brian, I was 18, almost 19 years old. I had a roommate. I was living away from school, and one of my friends left in terms of, an apartment, and I was scared, like, how do I make the rent? And so I was desperate to go and get a roommate, and someone introduced me to an acquaintance. He was a bit of was an older guy, but never had a job. He was dealing drugs. He was dealing drugs in terms of in the apartment there, wasn't in terms of pain, and then I got threatened physically, threatened in terms of my life. I had to go in terms of and find the courage to go to the local police department, fearing for my life. I had to go in terms of and get a restraining order. I actually, went to a local resource, believe it or not, and I learned about Women's Haven, which is a local nonprofit for those who are battered and abused wives. So it opened up in terms of in my eyes of, you're afraid, you're all alone.
Yeah.
And I was literally fearful of my life, and because of an act of desperation, I got into a situation and gained in a roommate that I shouldn't have, but it really made me in terms of appreciation that I wasn't alone, and they helped me that not only on a legal side, but I was able to plan and find a way to get out. The police took care of in terms of in the issue, for my safety, and so that I could leave and go somewhere else. I had a network that I reached into in a community at 18.
And until you hit that point where, in your case, was that fight or flight, pretty much at that point, to reach out.
I
That's
had
what
my
it
actual
took.
life threatened.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of in that, and because I talked with one of my friends whose mother was basically battered as a wife, from his father, her ex-husband. She told me about it. This woman, even courageous, middle-aged woman who had to live through in terms of things. So, it opened up in terms of in my eyes, and I was 18 and I was scared to death, and I went down, in terms of that and help in terms of those resources. And to this day, I'm absolutely grateful, and I have complete, in terms of compassion for those going through in those circumstances.
Yeah, and you said that, once again, your experience is different than a lot of people's for sure, but you said you came out with compassion for those people suffering. And I think
Of course. And again, the key takeaway is you have to have a support network, because when you're all alone, we're going to continue to be in an abusive situation.
Yeah. And that, once again, as we reiterated, both William and I's words, is that first step is the hardest to make in that right direction.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot over here, and I want to talk about so many interpersonal things going on and everything, but also with business and professional relationships. I know that a lot of people now, I would assume, have had professional relationships that maybe they went awry, and maybe they found that there's a person in their work group or in their company that they've had to deal with personally about that, and to go their immediate supervisor or their boss and come up with issues and say, hey, this person's not working out.
Yeah, so when we're talking about earlier, in our first part of the side of the triad, when we get into a personal dynamic, it's typically one-to-one.
Yeah.
When we start pivoting in the professional, we start to get a little bit more of a group versus the one-to-one. And so in this key identity is we have to talk about the need or identity of the group. When we were talking about earlier in the personal, we were talking about our own personal identity and our own personal in terms of, boundary and what we're trying to seek. But in a leadership sense, as when I'm trying to lead in terms of, in a company or in a group, we're talking about what we are trying to go achieve collectively for the needs of this group.
And
Number
in this case,
one,
as the business.
The business, or it could be the group. Some people are working in a department, you share a common responsibility, whether you're in a marketing or you're in an administrative or accounting, engineering, whatever it is. It's for what we call that small group. And so in terms of and communicating, in terms of what that collective need or collective identity, we have to share that common value. What is in terms of in that boundary? What is in that objective? Now, stating in terms of and along those lines, there are individuals who may, for whatever reason, look for ways to purposely protect their turf, purposely go against this identity for the group because of their own personal, what we call accolades. And we are trying to, in a way, take steps of good faith to try and bridge a divide and basically go down in terms of path. But when we talk about boundaries, we do have to set in terms of in clear boundaries, because one aspect when you're setting in boundaries is people will make mistakes. That's okay. But we have to also gauge, are they acting in good faith? Or are they basically constantly looking for ways to violate our boundaries? And more importantly, are they just trying to gaslight us?
Yeah.
And the thing is that gaslighting ends up becoming the toxic brew that you see in almost all of these situations in our personal life and our professional, and as well as society as a whole, is that, for example, we can all walk down the street, we can visualize a bank robbery in plain sight. That should be an agreeable fact. And when we're talking about bridging the divide, we have to have a common set of facts. And when you're working with a group of people, you have to have a common set of facts. People who want to gaslight want to basically create an alternative narrative. Well, they were given the money. They consented to giving them the money, right?
Yeah.
you're never going to be able to have a productive relationship if people just basically try to rewrite an actual fact.
Yeah, the facts, yeah.
Correct. We're out there, we saw a bank robbery in sight, that is a crime, and you have those that are trying to refute it. That's an extreme example, but we do know in terms of in our daily, personal, as well as many times our professional lives, there are people who are constantly out trying to gaslight. And a lot of the aspects in gaslighting is because it's meant to serve one's own interests. That's the whole nature behind the need for gaslighting. They always need to be right. They always need to be the center of attention. They need to kind of be in terms of in that force, that gravity field.
Yeah, and I think for the professional relationships out there, the gaslighting, it's not going to be as severe as a bank robbery. It might be. It's going to, I would assume, start a lot smaller and then escalate depending on
It does,
how much
but
they can
when we're
get their-
articulating again in these boundaries, some of them may be, if we're operating in good faith, this was our expectation. That's a boundary. Our expectation of we are delegating work, and some people are constant hoarders. Other aspects is we want to embrace new technologies, new ways of doing work. We're going to start in terms of we may do some work in a hybrid fashion where you're working remotely and thus we have to use a Zoom versus in office. And some people may, as we're setting in those boundaries, go against that grain. We, the group, are setting the boundaries because what we think is in the best interest of the group. As we're noticing in those boundary violations, we're trying to call it out. We're working in good faith and we're wanting people to correct. But a gaslighter tends to dig in. They tend to always find something. Then we have to draw a line.
Yeah, and for this case example, it was a period of a few months, or it could have been a culmination of a few years for some people in that situation. But I think at the end of the day is that you do all you can do with those tactics that are working.
Leadership is basically, if you think about it in this way, we look in our personal life and we look in our professional life. We all inherently, instinctively want to progress as people.
Yeah.
I think that is accepted,
acceptable statement.
that most people want to try and progress and thus ascend forward in terms of their lives. When we encounter another group of people, they would feel in terms of that common spirit. And so if we're talking in terms of in the company's ideals and we come up in terms of an idea, we want to, say, for example, start to innovate our marketing at the company to basically not only be more efficient, but to be more adaptable to these digital forms of marketing. But if you have someone constantly naysaying and critical, we're acting in good faith to hear their feedback.
Yeah.
But we also have to flush out how they're also looking for different ways, what we call confirmation bias, to find and pick facts that serve their own self-interest. Because maybe they like doing a printed physical newsletter brochure because it justified their job, their paycheck, their hours, versus the company saying, well, we're just wasting time. It's a whole entire production. It takes us a week to put together when we can just do an email newsletter and do a post on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, quickly like this. It seems a lot more efficient.
In
and the group generally agrees, but we have one person, vehemently opposed to it. So we try to make, some what we call reasonable good faith to hear their point of view and feedback. They say that they're willing and open and receptive, but then they start selectively finding things. We soon come to find out they're not acting in good faith. They're trying to sabotage us. So as a leadership, we have to draw a line.
Yeah, and then in the professional life, like you were saying, is to act professional and act cordial, but also act in good faith. And do you have any specific metrics or time frames that you think would be set in stone for those boundaries?
I like to use as a metaphor, when we think of the justice system, is we don't throw people in jail for a parking ticket, but we do throw people in jail for murder and robbery. We call it this degree of severity of the boundary violation. And so you have to, we as people develop a good gauge. It's like, for example, is if, you're the type of person that you want privacy in a bathroom and your spouse wants privacy and you walk in terms of bathroom, you say, I'm sorry. That's a simple infraction. But if you're there camping in there and violating of that, that's a severe in terms of boundary. Now take that away in terms of in a company when we're all trying to work together. If the company is basically number one, we used printed advertising, we have tremendous third-party mailing costs, postage costs, printing costs. Our read rate, our response has gone down, significant investment. The order all along was to get a better return and save money. It was already in terms of there. That was the boundary in terms of set. We're just exploring is what's the better thing to do in terms of budget? Should we just do some pay-per-click? Should we do and pay, like a MailChimp? Or should we just boost some posts on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok out there? But the boundary was already set. When someone was trying to be wed to, you see in terms of in the degree of it.
Of insanity, of just going.
Correct. So we have to develop in terms of in a meter, and then in leadership, we do create in terms of a space of where we call out the violation, warn them, but at the end, if this is continuing, we do have to hold accountability. Yeah. And obviously, in many respects, it could mean in terms of termination. Yeah. You have no other way. But again, like we talk about in a criminal justice context, it's similar in that we're trying to educate, have some degree of, punishment, call it out, but it has to be commensurate with what's going on, give an opportunity, but if it's happening repeatedly, there has to be clear accountability. Because without accountability, you will ultimately basically detract in terms from the team, and it will just basically derail any efforts and sabotage, any forward progress.
Yeah.
And the accountability is necessary.
And the smaller the groups are, the more people are gradually affected, and it just can increase.
Right, but you can also see in society how small groups of people can hold up the progress of an entire society. If we were to pick the issue, whether we're talking a universal background check, if we're talking about, in terms of, the access to pro-choice, pick whether as, student loan forgiveness, you're going to have these different passionate voices, but there are numerous in terms of issues, climate change, all these that 70% or more of the public want some sort of progress on. Right. Why is it that you have a small group constantly sabotaging and working against? Again, we have to employ in terms of those principles. We're trying to negotiate, work together in good faith, hear from their points of view, hear them out, but we're also trying to articulate shared values. We also have to have common sets of facts, because if we're gaslighting, you're never going to get anywhere.
Right.
It's like, for example, when we talk about, we see on TV, we see in terms of, the kids at Uvalde who were gunned down, and we're saying is, we need to find a way to limit access to individuals who are mentally ill. You're going to have someone says, well, the gun didn't kill anyone. It's just basically in terms of people. I go, we have to also keep it out of the hands of people who are mentally unstable, but also too the fact that they have that access to such high-powered firearms. Compounds the amount of severity. The thing is that people are going to find ways to gaslight the situation, thus nothing ever gets done. And you can find a myriad of, in terms of issues, when we're talking about whether we want to build a road, build a new airport, whether we need water. I mean, we're out here, in the Southwest,
no kidding.
And it's dry, whether we need a desalinization plant. Think of all these issues. And the common thread is we as people want to progress.
Yeah.
But we also have to, in many respects, find ways that we're trying to work with people of opposing points of view. But if we can build a big enough of a coalition, we have to basically cut ties and isolate them. You have no other way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah. And broad picture, broad spectrum. There's so many little minutiae of detail that you can go in for every single subject. And then,
it is,
and then the
but you
news,
see a lot of these takeaways from our personal or professional to society as a whole. These common threads exist. They're just on bigger scales, but we just don't realize and see what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Moving on to our final topic here about the family and friends. I know you touched about this a little bit a few minutes ago in the earlier parts of the show, but just go over some more, expectations and boundaries for family and friends. I know, for example, personally, moving away from, say, a location can be one of them. To just at this point in 2022.
Some aspects, honestly, Brian, often involves disassociation and limiting in terms of their
access.
contact.
Yeah,
I mean, there are numerous people when they're describing in terms of the dynamics between their own mother and father, that there are those that as they've grown up and gotten older, that they have a different relationship that they maintain with their mother versus their father. They're maintaining in terms of those boundaries. People have to, honestly, in terms of have some of those conversations that in those aspects, because we're kind of in a little bit of a society where we always assume there's a built-in benevolence within our own families. I just say is that family dynamics can be complicated, and some of the people who are those who are basically destructive to us can be within our own family. It just becomes complicated as how we deal with them. As I try to, educate and advise people, we need to make choices, and that's just part of the boundary. Is that, say, for example, if your father, in terms of in growing up, was the type of person who was very critical of you, always putting you down, not available, might have been potentially abusive, you draw the line in terms of how you expect to be treated or how you may relate and communicate in terms with them. You're still being open, you still in terms of love them, but in terms of in setting those boundaries or limiting how you socialize. In other words, it shouldn't be this, too many people have this guilt thrown upon them that it's as though they have this absolute right to do whatever they want because it's family.
Yeah, and it seems like in some cases that it's taboo to speak up and
Correct.
but that's taking that first
and especially
step.
Depending upon the cultural dynamics too, and the fact that it could be very traditional and male dominated makes it even more problematic and difficult for those to voice in terms of from themselves and basically identifying out how they can be absolutely destructive in terms of how they are treating the individual, in terms of in that. But this is necessary. This is where we're building up in that awareness, because it's also affecting our own emotional well-being. It's also skewing and clouding how we deal with other people outside of our own family. And so there are, tremendous amount of what I call external ripple effects as a result. And so claiming within our own close family and friends of those who can be, what I call the destructive, where we need to break up, is extremely important. Because too often, if you ever notice in situations what we call abuse, assault, sexual assault, and all the statistics say that you're more likely to have someone who you know and who's close. All the statistics tell you. So you don't need in terms of that extreme of an example, but when we think of in all the other issues of the negative, of abuse, of toxic relationship, again, statistics tell you is that it's more likely to be someone who's close to you. Why? Because people who we're close to and who we trust, we're allowed to basically, our guard, our filter.
You put that wall down.
Correct. thus we're more vulnerable to that. And that's why we have to build up that awareness to basically identify, assert in terms of boundaries, speak up for ourselves, and honestly find a way to where we may have to disassociate ourselves for our own health and emotional well-being.
Yeah, and I can just think of the families out there, as you mentioned, some of the more traditional type family styles. But if you're someone that was born and raised and grown up in that aspect, and then you look outside your house and you're sitting there thinking, well, wait, that's not how it's supposed to be. There's other ways. There's other
Correct.
ways that we're
Correct,
gonna be more happy.
and you will see in terms of and how it plays in terms of drug use and so many other different ills is that in terms of what people are exposed to in these, and so unfortunately we get a bubble-like mentality when we're stuck in that close tribe of our own family or friends unit. We could be clouded to what is actually wrong and destructive.
Yeah. Stuck in the bubble, in that snow globe, and how everything just comes in on you.
Correct.
Those are all three great topics to come into this workshop of breaking up. I just wanted to ask you, Will, what are some of the key points that we talked about here to wrap up the show, to have for some takeaways for the viewers?
So some of the key takeaways is we have to also start doing an inventory and identifying what are our own personal boundaries and what they are. We have to also start articulating them. We also have to start finding out what the other individual's boundaries are. We also have to, in addition, start creating some of what these mutual goals are, whether they're in the relationship, whether we're in a professional environment, because we need a shared goal or a shared vision of what we're working towards in terms of in that DNA. And as we find that if we're not working towards it, are they working against it? Then we have to kind of identify some of those boundary, violations in terms of in there. And as well as we have to operate within that common set of facts, because if they're going to continuously gaslight ourselves, when we're getting gaslit, then we're also going to have to make a determination. There may be no interest for what we call a common set of goals in terms of progress. And so that's what's absolutely necessary in making the determination is whether we need to go through that process, that it's a time to disassociate and divorce ourselves from this individual.
Yeah, and I think that each specific person out there has a different scope or a different level of those boundaries and expectations, because it's all relative to the individual. So.
Right.
Once again, my name is Brian. I wanted to thank everyone here for tuning into our show. Will, I'd love to thank you again for the show. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you, neighbors. As we come in terms of this Christmas and holiday season, let's all try to look for the good in one another, and let's all spread random acts of kindness to everyone. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.